Welcome to the Bad Roman Podcast. On this show, we talk with veterans, community leaders, Christians and non-Christians as we explore the entanglement of Christians with the state. The Bad Roman Project was created out of the firm belief that as Christians, we are called to follow Christ, not the state. Here is your host, Craig Hargis.
Hey folks, let's talk about nonviolent civil resistance. Let's talk about loving your neighbor and your enemy as yourself. Let's talk about economic justice. Today, Nicholas Harrelson comes back on the show to talk about all of this from an essay he wrote that is absolutely fantastic.
We'd rather serve God than serve Caesar, you feel me? Right. I'm just trying to live what he said. I'm just trying to live what he said. Safe to say that I'm bad. So it's safe to say that I'm bad. So it's safe to say that I'm bad.
Nicholas, how are you doing?
Doing well. I'm doing well. The winter is waning in North Carolina, and which means we're about to have pollen season. So we're in that intermediate time where I can still breathe and the weather's a little bit warmer.
Well, I mean, you can hear me right now. I mean, I don't know. It feels like we're going to go into spring, and then the next week we go back into winter here in Memphis. I can't figure it out. And at the same time, the pollen is trying to figure it out themselves. So one day I wake up and I feel great. I can breathe. The next day, like today, I wake up and my eyes are glossed over. My nose is stopped up, which, you know, people are used to listening to this podcast. They're going to hear me sound stopped up quite a bit. And I think it's the pollen, but I think the pollen is a little confused about what's going on right now with the weather in Memphis.
That's why I tell people, you know, you don't really need to move to the Middle South. You know, you don't want to come down here because spring and fall, you're liable to have 4 seasons in one day. So just keep going to Florida.
Yeah, keep going to Florida.
Right through the Middle South and head on down to Florida. They love y'all down there from up north in the Midwest.
Well, you know, the Florida likes to pretend they're the part of the Southeastern Conference. You know, we were talking about some basketball a little bit before we started recording. You know, this the day after my Razorbacks beat the Kansas Jayhawks, the defending national champions, by 1 point. We moved on to the Sweet 16, and I could not be more excited. And I was running through work like a complete child, celebrating. And you actually brought it up. I wasn't going to mention it, but since you brought it up while we were before we started recording, I'm going to talk about it now because I'm still very excited about going back to the Sweet 16 for this 3rd straight year.
Yeah, you know, I didn't even know they were doing the NCAA tournament this year.
I don't believe that, actually, because as I know you're a Tar Heel fan, and I wasn't going to bring that up either, but you're a Tar Heel fan, and they started off number 1 in the regular season and did not make the tournament.
Yeah, you know, I was actually, you know, pretty proud of my boys for setting a record yet again this year. First preseason number 1 team to never make the NCAA tournament since they expanded it to the round or to 68 teams. You know, so you know, yet another record that falls to the UNC Tar Heels. So I don't
get a chance to pick on you very much. You know, when you've been on the show before, you've always tried to, you know, pick your spots with me to pick on me about different things when it comes to barbecue or my sports teams or whatever. But I finally get a chance. And I don't think I'm going to do it. I think I'm going to let you alone about this and just be friendly. You know, we're going to talk about pacifism here a little bit. So I think it'd probably be the best idea just to let you alone about it. But I do have a question, though, because you do work for Duke as a Tar Heel fan. I'm very curious how that goes. I used to have a phone or a picture of you on my phone that you shared of you were wearing a Duke T-shirt.
Yeah,
as a Tar Heel fan, waving the American flag, wasn't it?
Oh yeah. Wow, you made sure to get me on a. I have to say, at that particular moment, I understandably stooped that low because it got me free tickets into Cameron Indoor. But yeah, you know, there's a couple of funny stories. My dad's a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill, and I never went to school there, but in the South, that doesn't really matter. And so I've been a lifelong UNC fan, but unfortunately, UNC does not. It's a public school, so it doesn't have a seminary. And so I applied to Duke, and when I got accepted, my dad congratulated me and said, you know, I want to congratulate you for getting into the University of New Jersey at Durham. So from thenceforth, he receives something from the Duke Student Store every Christmas. But yes, I do. I work for the Office of Student Veterans at Duke. And, I used to enjoy calling myself an aspiring pacifist. And so I thought, the best way to remedy that situation and really practice pacifism was to get a job working at Duke University, where I have to practice pacifism on a daily basis.
Well, I'm really curious because, like I said, it's been quite a minute since you've been on the show. The last time you guest hosted with Christianopolis when we did Jesus the Anarchist book, or Christian anarchism, and that's been a little bit. Even then, and you've been on the show before then. I'm really kind of curious, and for folks who may be curious and who know who you are, maybe kind of catch us up and tell us about this whole litter of kids you got going on and your anarchist toddler running around the house. So let's talk about that, and then we'll get into your piece here that you wrote.
Yeah. So for folks who don't know me, this whole road down Christian anarchism began with me serving 6 years in the Army. I am a combat wounded veteran of Iraq. Did 2 tours in Iraq as an infantryman, and that's really my experiences there were what initiated me finding an interest in Christian anarchism and Tolstoy in particular. I also worked for government for a while after I got out of the Army, which I have to say was also a big influential factor in me not liking government. It was an experience in futility and, taught me a lot of patience dealing with bureaucracy. But ultimately, it ended with me not working in government anymore. It was just not a job that I was well suited for, I don't think, especially in the period after me coming out of the military. These days, I'm now a transitional deacon in the Anglican Catholic Church and working at the Office of Student Veterans at Duke. And I am pursuing a Ph.D. at Aberdeen University in political theology and Christian ethics. I've got, as Craig said, 2 very young children who very much embody the anarchist ideal, and one more so than the other. And they may or may not make an appearance at some point in the podcast. They don't listen very well at all.
Well, we can turn it into a round table. I mean, if they do show up, we'll just have your kids on as well. We'll just make it a round table.
Only one of them speaks English, so it's they both will have a lot to say, but only one of them will be understandable.
Okay, great. Well, I've got some questions then. I want to bring something else up too, because you pop in every once in a while in a discussion group, and there was something that y'all did with your church that I'm very proud of y'all for doing. It's something that I've come to understand as far as when it comes to universal restoration. It was something that, and I'm not saying that you hold to that or even your church holds to it, but y'all just was holding a discussion with David Bentley Hart about this. And you invited folks to come over to y'all's page and to read it. And I went onto the page and I just thanked y'all for doing it. And I got blasted by some folks who were following along on this page. And I couldn't figure out. And I told the one guy, I can't even remember his name, but I think he's an Anglican pastor or priest. I don't know what y'all call yourselves. But what I'm saying is he got so upset. And I was like, man, you just sound like a very angry person. I said, I just think that I'm just very thankful that they're having this conversation. They're just having a conversation. It's all it is. It's not like you have to believe this and we're going to believe this and we're going to teach this at our church. It was just a conversation. And I just wanted to bring it up before we get into this because I'm very grateful for y'all doing that and hosting that, because I like the idea that we can have these conversations and maybe not be angry with one another about it, because this was a conversation they were having back in the early church, but they weren't mad at each other about it. Everybody understood there were universalists, there were annihilationists, there were eternal conscious torment folks, all this stuff, but they weren't angry with each other about it. And you're seeing this conversation or this topic infuriate some people, and I can't figure out why. What does it matter? If you're right, okay, you're right. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. In the end, we're all going to find out at some point. But the reason I wanted to bring it up, because like I said, I'm very thankful for y'all to do this and to host it, regardless of whether y'all teach it or whatever. Just the fact that y'all just were willing to have a conversation, the fact that it upset so many people, that still blows my mind.
There's a couple of things at work there. One that's, apocatastasis or universal restoration is a topic that I've been interested in. I actually wrote an article for the North American Anglican on C.S. Lewis as a potential universalist. And ultimately, what I concluded is that he has a very broad soteriology, a very broad idea of salvation, but that he falls short of such folks as George MacDonald, who he very much was influenced by, who even makes an appearance in one of his books. He falls short of universal restoration, but I think he could possibly be termed a hopeful universalist. But, there's a couple of things going on there that I think, to be charitable to some of these folks who were very upset. One, Dr. David Bentley Hart and Father Robert Hart, who's the rector of my church, to a lesser degree, they can be somewhat confrontational in their approach at times, which, I don't know if that's just maybe who they are as people, or if, it's a particular way in which they approach discussion or what have you. I think most people know that Dr. Hart can rile some people up with his approach. But then, two, to be very charitable, as charitable as I possibly can be, I think that when it comes to people who view the idea of certain universalism as a heresy, they view it as something as people leading others astray and potentially putting someone's soul in jeopardy. And if that is truly why they are as upset as they are, then I have some ability to understand that.
Right.
When I think of it that way, it makes it a little bit easier to endure some of the harsh words that are thrown around, and a little bit easier to approach people with a charitable attitude. But as you said, there was some pretty interesting and severe disruption caused by us hosting that, and it, it's not a doctrine of our church. We don't proclaim it to be such. I have my questions about certain universalism, and I certainly cannot say that I am one. I probably fall more neatly into the category of hopeful universalist. But like you said, Dr. Hart is the younger brother of the rector of our church. And he's a very famous theologian, and our church is situated right between UNC and Duke. And so it just made sense that if Dr. Hart was willing to do a 5-session book study on a fairly well-known book for free, that we would take him up on the offer and see if it might be of interest to folks around us, just to try to have spark some interest in the church and show that we have some serious theological conversation, and that we are a place where that kind of stuff happens. I think it was definitely taken out of context pretty severely.
Right. And not to make this show about universalism or annihilationism or eternal conscious torment, not trying to do that. Where I land on it, I remember you saying this one time in one of the groups that we run around in, that you called yourself a hopeful universalist. And I understand that. And what I find so fascinating about the topic, and, talking with Abby Kleckner or Ari Spiver or Scott Goldman about this, who were staunch universalists, and they all said to me when we did a show on that, we're just tired of arguing about it, and we won't engage it. And I get that now. At the time I was like, no, I want you to argue about it because I'm still trying to learn this. I need to learn more about this. I'm very curious about it. And now I've gotten to the point now, I'm not going to argue with folks about it because it's not that important to me for people to understand universalism. As long as you're not running around telling people they're going to burn in hell forever if they don't do a certain thing, then we're good. Okay. So I don't really argue with folks about it. And that's where I got to when I did say something on that Facebook page of y'all's. The guy came at me and I'm like, I'm not doing this. I'm at work and I'm not going to fight with somebody about universalism because I don't care if you believe in it. I really don't care if you believe in it. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you believe in it or not.
Right. And the arguments tend to, especially, I know that Dr. Hart's primary complaint is that no one would actually engage with the argument he was trying to make. And it's true, because a lot of people tend to just come into those groups and start throwing around the Fifth Ecumenical Council and how it proclaimed it a heresy, when in fact it did not, and they can't point to the language where it did. What they point to is that the Fifth Ecumenical Council condemned Origen as a heretic. Origen was a universalist. And so, they're extrapolating from things that don't exist. And so they can't make an argument against Dr. Hart's understanding. And so it ends up just being a lot of, contentious words thrown around, and very few people, actually attempting to engage with the argument that's actually provided in the book. So it's sort of like the Russia-Ukraine war. There's like two armies on a side of, on either side of the line, and the line doesn't move regardless of what you throw at it. Nobody's going to give up on their side, and it's a mess typically, and it's never very fruitful.
Well, it's something that just on this topic again, and I don't want to make the show about it, but talking about Origen, from my understanding, they weren't calling him a heretic because he was a universalist. They were calling that the heresy was that he was saying that even Satan and his demons would be restored, and they were calling that heretical. Not the fact that he believed that God would be restoring his creation as universalism, but that he even included Satan and his demons, and that was the heresy. It wasn't they were calling universalism heretical. It was just that that one thing about Origen that they were calling heretical. And it was one of those things, and reading things about Tertullian, who I adore when it comes to reading about the early church, when it comes to the entanglement of the Christian with the state. I adore him so much. I did not know he was an eternal conscious torment guy until I listened to David Artman, Grace Saves All podcast, and he mentioned it, or somebody on his show mentioned it. I was like, wow. But it did not change the way I felt about Tertullian. You know what I'm saying? So it didn't change the way I felt about Tertullian and how outspoken he was when it came to how the Christians and the state were not to be entangled with one another.
Yeah. Well, it's really funny. I actually met another Christian anarchist, or at least, someone who's in the field, academic field, studying anarchism, who was attending the podcast. Dr. Gary Chartier, I think is his name. And I can't remember the school that he teaches out. It's out in the Southwest somewhere, I believe. But just because I asked a question about, the popularity of universalism within Christian anarchist circles to Dr. Hart, he ended up sending me, he has a new book coming out, Christianity and the State, I believe it's called, and sent me some of the stuff from that. And we're going to be striking up a conversation pretty soon. And so it was really interesting because I asked a question about the popularity of universalism within Christian anarchist circles. Why is that? What do you think the connection is there? And sure enough, there was a person in the audience who in fact studies Christian anarchism, so it kind of proved the point of the question. So yeah, it was an interesting discussion, and I really enjoyed it despite some of the speed bumps we might have had.
Yeah. It's always fun for me when I meet somebody in real life, not just, through social media, when they claim to be a Christian anarchist. And I ran into one, I started training jiu-jitsu, and I ran into one in jiu-jitsu. I mean, I know a lot, some folks in the jiu-jitsu society, in Christian anarchist society, who do this, but I met one at this gym that I train at. I was wearing one of our Bad Roman T-shirts, and it was the we ought to obey God rather than man. It had the Christian anarchist symbol, the Jesus fish with the anarchy in it. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And he saw it, and he started asking questions. He goes, "Yeah, I used to be a libertarian," and I just gave up on it. And I just consider myself a Christian anarchist. And we were stretching, getting ready to start training. And I'm like, I want to hear more, so I'm going to get him on the show, and we're going to talk about jiu-jitsu and Christian anarchy, because it's fascinating to me how those two worlds kind of meet at the same time. It's strange, when you get to meet folks in real life that are like, yeah, they claim to be Christian anarchists. Well, I'm not the only crazy person running around in Memphis talking about this.
Yeah. It's always fun to run into somebody like that.
Hey folks, Craig here, and I'd like to let y'all know we are always looking for writers to contribute to our blog. I don't care if you have any experience or not. 2 or 3 of our contributors had no prior experience writing, and it turns out they have a real knack for it. Our project coordinator helps them put the articles together, and she publishes them on our website and Facebook page, and you will also have the option to come on the show and go more in depth about your article. So if you like what we're doing at The Bad Roman and would like to try your hand at writing, then send us an email at thebadromanpodcast@gmail.com. We're having a blast with this project, and we would love for you to join us in helping promote it. Now back to the show.
All right, let's get into this essay a little bit if you want to.
Absolutely.
All right, cool. So in the introduction to this essay, you mentioned wanting to compare the theory and practice of Tolstoy and Martin Luther King Jr. in regards to their nonviolent stance, loving your neighbor, and economic justice, and their differences in practical implementation. And I love that you chose these two to talk about, because I've always found it fascinating when we talk about Martin Luther King Jr. on the show and Tolstoy on the show, that MLK, he still worked through the state trying to get what he saw as what he wanted to see happen. And Tolstoy was like, we'll have none of that. And I love how you compare the two in this essay. And let's start there. Let's just talk about the comparison real quick. Well, not real quick. Let's talk about it for 20 minutes.
So, the interesting thing, one, is that most people don't realize or recognize the significance of the historical connection between Tolstoy and King. That is built on a relationship that has Gandhi as the mediator. So Tolstoy, in the latter half of his life, wrote several letters, I believe it was 8 in total, entitled Letters to a Hindu, where he was speaking back and forth with Gandhi, who was very captivated by Tolstoy's reading of the Sermon on the Mount. And then, Gandhi very much adopted or worked in conjunction with Tolstoy to develop this understanding of nonviolent civil resistance, which he implemented. It was very much a practical use of that understanding in the realm of politics in India. Gandhi was very much he was what some people might call he had held a compromised understanding of Tolstoyan pacifism, wherein he did not necessarily believe that violence was never a thing that was of use. And so it makes sense that when Gandhi and King were very much in touch, I believe King even visited Gandhi to see how he operated in India with his activism. It makes sense that King very much started from this kind of compromised Tolstoyan stance, where in particular, King was a very practical individual who had initially a very specific goal of desegregating the American South. But he worked, at least initially, with an understanding that law and the state could have some benefit for his activism. He very much recognized, at that time, the federal government was saying that the American South had to desegregate, but the American South was refusing to do it. And so King very much talked about, I'll see if I can find it here. I believe it's his letter from a Birmingham jail. Well, so without actually quoting him, he talked about just and unjust laws, that a just law is a law that very much falls under the categorization that I believe it was Aquinas and St. Augustine would say, that laws that follow the natural and moral law, laws that follow or in conjunction to God's law and commandments. That is a just law. An unjust law is a law that does not follow God's commandment, that does not follow natural law. And so he recognized that, some laws could be good, which I think even most Christian anarchists would say, if it's a law that is very much in tune with God's law or with God's commandments, then it's probably a good law. It's not something we would disobey as a Christian, so we're not going to disobey it just to spite the state either. But yeah, so the totality of my project and probably the main theme and the thing I'm going to try to argue is that by the end of King's life, he was much closer to Tolstoyan anarchism and pacifism than he was to his original Gandhian stance. That he started off as a person who was seeking to use nonviolent civil resistance for a very practical and very focused reason. And by the end of his life, he had started the Poor People's Campaign. He was a pacifist and against the Vietnam War. His idea of the beloved community was something that he believed should expand or should extend across the globe. It was not something that was just relegated to American politics or American society. It was something that, as Tolstoy would probably argue, Tolstoy would say that the Sermon on the Mount is relevant in every situation, at every time, and in every place. Originally, King might not have believed that. I don't necessarily know if that's the case or not, but his actions were much more focused and much smaller scale initially. And so I think by the end of his life, had he lived longer than he did, he probably would have very much been someone who embraced the totality of Tolstoy's understanding of the Sermon on the Mount.
Well, it's interesting watching how all that unfolded with King. I'm going to paraphrase this, and it was something he said. He said, "I can't." Oh man, something about making a law that makes it harder for you to kill me or something. But at the end of the day, the state ended up killing him anyway. And, we know that as a fact now. They've come out and finally admitted to the fact that they are the ones who ended his life. So it's very interesting to see how that played out, for somebody who was trying to work through the state during that time to stop the oppression but the way he was going about it, being pacifist about it. And like I told you before we started recording, it was very interesting to see too that how adamant he was to tell the folks who were following him along, we're not going to put hands on the state. We're not going to do that. He was very adamant about it. And if you see how productive that really was, and the fact how it was changing people's minds and their hearts about this, the fact that they were not going to put their hands on the state while the state was putting their hands on them. You see what I'm saying? So that was, I think, I don't know if people gloss over that so much these days, but in conversation with folks I've had about it, they don't tend to talk about that too much when it comes to King. They talk about, the protest, all this stuff. They don't focus on the fact that he was adamant about not putting hands on the state. And it's something that, as a pacifist myself now, I understand. Now, I'm going to have a lot of loud opinions about the state, but I'm not willing to pick up a pistol and go fight them and start a new revolution like a lot of folks we see in the liberty movement, quote unquote, wanting to start a new revolution. No, at the end of the day, there's still somebody there holding a sword. And Jesus said to put that sword away.
Right. It is interesting because in the very least, we do know that the state was very much manipulative and seeking to, have control over King as much as possible, because they did view him as someone with the potential of causing a great disturbance. But I think that this comes back to the fact that even from the very outset, King, as a Christian, understood the very same thing that Tolstoy argued about violence. He actually says, and I don't remember exactly where he wrote this, but he speaks to violence and he says, the ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence, you may murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. So it goes. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And so the thing that's interesting about King and Tolstoy from the very outset is that, they had a focus on reconciliation, which I think is a beautiful reflection of how Christ operated. Christ came to be the redemption for all, even the ones who killed him. And so in resisting them and in being political, Christ could not be violent because he sought the salvation of the very people he would have acted violently against. And so King didn't want to simply secure a new world for African Americans. He didn't want to simply prove something right to the admonishment of others. He sought to have a community in which the oppressor and the oppressed could live together as brother and sister. The only way to offer that type of reconciliation when there's violence is for one person to refuse to be violent. And he recognized that that was a practical thing to do, because that refusal to act violently against someone who's acting violently against you, that highlights the absurdity of the person who is being violent. And so that was a very practical thing, especially, in the new age of media, where, it was broadcast all over the country and the world, these scenes of police violently beating nonviolent protesters. But in the end, it also allowed for the cycle of violence to stop, because it stopped with someone, and it allows for reconciliation afterwards, which I think is a very deeply Tolstoyan concept. He talks about this to Tsar Alexander III. Tsar Alexander III's father was killed by an assassin, and Tolstoy actually sent a letter to the Tsar requesting that he forgive or provide clemency to the assassins, and to just send them to America. And that if he did that, he would stop the cycle of violence there, and he would be acting on the commandment of God. And so he would be acting on an authority that is much higher than his own. It's a very interesting concept, and one of the I remember reading this, one of the assassins that was actually put to death by Tsar Alexander III was related to it was either Lenin or Trotsky. And so you have to wonder, if Tsar Alexander III had provided clemency to that assassin, how would that have affected the communist
history?
Right, history in general. It could be 100% different than how it turned out, because it's Dr. Steve Hickey's book, Second Tolstoy, goes into it quite a bit, talking about, I think it was Lenin, talking about Lenin and how the Tsar putting his relative, I can't remember if it was a brother or a cousin, putting them to death affected him so badly that that's what sent him down this trajectory that was completely against the royal family, completely against the Tsar, and we know how that turned out eventually.
Right, and I don't want to get too far off your essay, but I want to bring something up. This topic of pacifism is always so interesting to me, because if I talk about it, and I love the conversation, I love the topic, and I love engaging folks about this, because when it comes to nonviolent resistance, even if it comes to your family, and I don't have kids, I'm not married, so I understand the argument that I get from folks. Well, if somebody breaks into my home, they're going to harm my children or my wife, they're going to be met with some violent resistance. I get it.
Yeah.
At the same time, that's not what Jesus instructed us to do. Okay, and then this is this is the pushback I get is, let's say somebody's going to shoot somebody, you don't shoot them first, type thing. So that's it. Always goes down the same thing when it comes to resisting violence, that you have to respond violently with a pistol. And I understand the argument, and I used to be that guy. But the more I've read the early church and how there were a couple of things that they were universalists about. Not universalism, but, universalists about was no king but Christ. They knew who their king was. They had no interest in involving themselves with the state, and they would not harm anybody back who was harming them. And that's missed today. And I think what you were talking about with King just a minute ago, how they would just the very fact that they would not respond violently back changed so many folks' minds and hearts about this, that it made a bigger change than had it been them out there with a bunch of pistols, fighting the cops, who were trying to harm them. And I think that's missed because you don't know what's going to happen later on, or how Jesus or how God could use your example of not violently responding to them, even if it means losing your life. I understand we're not trying to, we don't get out of here. None of us get out of here alive, right? So what are we going to do if we're going to try and change the world? Are we going to do it violently, or are we going to do it the way Jesus instructed us to, and the example of Jesus and how Jesus changed the world?
Yeah.
So this topic, I posted something from Rival Nations in our discussion group, and it was about this topic for the most part. But the meme that they shared was just some dude holding a gun, and immediately people jump on, well, I've got my 9mm if they break into my home. And I was like, did you read the article? Did you read that? Nobody read it. They just saw a meme with a guy with holding a gun.
I mean, look, as an aspiring meme farmer myself, I can certainly say that I've done my fair share of reacting to a meme or a picture or an article without having read the full thing. We're all guilty of it, and if you say you aren't, then you're just lying to yourself.
Right.
I mean, this is when the clergyman, the pastor in me comes out a little bit. I mean, one, there's a reason that we have a saying that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. It's true. When you act in a way that is congruent with Christ's own actions, it has a profound effect. It will be something that eventually makes it to others and becomes an inspiration, an inspiring act of nonviolent defiance. We've seen that as recently as, just a couple of years ago, I believe in Libya, where a large group of Coptic Orthodox Christians were put to death by jihadists and proclaimed Christ to their grave, and did so nonviolently. And it's had a profound effect on people who read the story. But as a pastor, as a clergyman, we are fallen creatures. We are fallen from God's grace, and we have to constantly be checking our own actions and reflecting on how we live our lives, because we sin without ever even thinking about it, without even recognizing that we've sinned. We have certainly committed it. And so the highest ideal that I can call people to on a daily basis is to constantly aspire to act in a way in accordance with Christ's own actions. And so as long as you are constantly considering it, if you're considerate of the ways in which you have reacted to things, the ways in which you might react to things, then you're doing the work. You can't hold yourself to a perfect position all the time. If someone provides me the hypothetical scenario that someone breaks into my house and tries to murder my kids, the only thing I can tell them is that I certainly hope I would try in every way possible that is nonviolent to make the situation better. But I can't tell you how I'd react.
Right. And I think that's something, too, that I was just thinking about, too. And I don't know how I would actually react in this situation. I could sit here and talk about it all day long, and I pray to God that I'm never in that situation. It's something what I was mentioning jujitsu a while ago. To me, the go-to is to pick up a pistol and respond with a pistol. To me, that's very lazy.
Yeah.
Okay. And I said that one time in our discussion group, and I got blasted for that, and I'm like, listen, the reason I took up jujitsu, because I recognize there might be a time where there's going to be a need for self-defense. And if I could learn a way to restrain somebody without killing them, and even in the process, I might get killed myself, but at the same time, people are getting away and their own lives are saved. That's how I approach these things now. Like, I recognize that there might be a time. I mean, hell, man, I live in Memphis. It's a dangerous city to live in, right? You never know. You got to keep your head on a swivel around here sometimes, because you just don't know. I mean, there's a lot of crazy things that happen in this city. But at the same time, I'm not willing to, even if it means me losing my life, is if I can protect somebody, that to me is loving my neighbor and my enemy at the same time, even if it means losing my life. Does that make sense? Or am I just spouting off something, just because I spend too much time maybe thinking about this, but that's the main reason I started training jujitsu is because I recognize there might be a need for self-defense, but at the same time, I don't want to pick up my 9mm and put a bullet in somebody's head in self-defense. I'm not willing to do that. I used to be that guy. I was that guy that would not hesitated to pick up that pistol and end somebody's life in protection of my life or somebody else's life. Now, I'm like, I'm not willing to do that. This is not an invitation for people to come at me and say, well, let's see what Craig's going to do now. Please don't do that, because I'm training jujitsu and I'll figure out a way to restrain you, but I'm not going to kill you back.
I've always been told that the Judy chop is one of the most powerful defensive moves known to man. So I think, and this is, again, me coming from more of a pastorally type setting. I think, as creatures, we have a tendency to focus on the temporal, the here and the now. Ultimately, Christ came to offer us eternal salvation, eternal life. And so it makes sense to me, and this is a very Tolstoyan concept, that, we should probably focus on living the way Christ told us to live instead of being so blind to that by everything else. One of his biggest critiques with the church is that they were constantly focused on speaking to Christ's divinity and then completely ignoring the words that were very plain and simple that told us how we should live one to another. And so I think if people took a little more time to kind of block out the here and the now and to actually think on the eternal, they'd probably care a little bit more about what Christ said, about how you're supposed to live, which then in turn puts a lot more importance on those words. And so you really start to think, well, what exactly did he mean when he said, to return good for evil? It seems pretty simple. And I think, the Tolstoyan concept would be is that he's not speaking in any kind of secret language there. He's quite literally saying when someone commits evil on you, you commit a good in return. And, that then really complicates a lot of things that we on a societal level or a cultural level view as being just actions. It becomes much more difficult to justify things that we as Americans or as Westerners might view as being a very just behavior.
All right, let's talk about Tolstoy a little bit. We talked about MLK. You brought up Tolstoy again. Let's talk about Tolstoy. What I love so much about reading what you sent me, and this you're going to explain this here a little bit, that it's not out where people can easily search it, but it's going to be at some point where people will be able to read, and you're going to add to it and maybe turn it into a book at some point. And dude, if you turn it into a book, guess what? You're coming back on the Bad Roman podcast, and we're going to talk about it again. So,
sounds good. Don't threaten me with a good time.
Tolstoy, to me, somebody sent me she sent me a picture of a book she found. She's in South Korea right now, and it was a War and Peace by Tolstoy. I have not read it. I said, but you can't go wrong with Tolstoy. All right. So, and she's one of those that are kind of on the fence about Christian anarchy and about this stuff, but she's kind of coming around, and then sometimes she kind of reverts back to what. Anyway,
yeah. When
it comes to Tolstoy, and I love what I love about Tolstoy, he was very matter of fact and very like it is what it is type. When you think about what Jesus was saying, Tolstoy was like, it is what it is. This is what Jesus said, and this is what we're going to do. I want to talk about that a little bit because I get accused of being black and white, and I'm admittedly black and white when it comes to my thinking. I don't see very much gray, if any, when it comes to anything going on in my life. That's what I love about Tolstoy is he's very black and white about this, and Jesus was very black and white about it. Jesus wasn't gray in a lot of areas when it comes to some of this. You love your neighbor and your enemy.
Yeah.
There was no instead or well, but if your enemy does this, it's okay to cut off the Roman soldier's ear off. Now we'll put it away. I love the black and whiteness about how Tolstoy approaches this topic. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, Tolstoy provided simplicity in his understanding of the Sermon on the Mount. And that's a beautiful thing. Now, Tolstoy was known for being quite radical in his attempts at adhering to his own interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount. But he stumbled and fell just like the rest of us. He even spoke to that because quite a few of his critics at the time would point out that he himself was not succeeding all the time at the things that he was saying were necessary. And he made the comment that, instead of, it was something along the lines of, instead of speaking ill of the path that I'm attempting to follow, speak ill of the man who's stumbling down the path. Call out my own deficiencies, but don't say that the path that I'm trying to follow is deficient itself. It's a great thing and a very Christian concept, and it should seem very apparent to most Christians that we're sinful creatures who constantly have to repent from our own sins. And just because I repented yesterday doesn't mean today or even the same day won't go back and commit a sin that I have to repent for at some point. It's part of our nature. And so, Tolstoy, I don't know if you can hear my child, the anarchist screaming in the back.
No, they're all good, man. I love them.
It's one of those situations, and I love it because, one of the things that I took from the military that I very much enjoyed and very much think is applicable to civilian life, to a Christian life, is this concept of simplicity. We have a tendency as Christians, especially Orthodox Christians, to just overcomplicate the situation and the things that we're required to do and the things we're required to adhere to, the creeds that we're supposed to know and understand. We overcomplicate things to the point that it just becomes a muddied picture that we aren't quite sure what to make of it or how to behave within it. But Tolstoy had no problems with that. He very much put all of his emphasis on the Sermon on the Mount because he viewed that as Christ's literal words about how we were supposed to live. And it was applicable to Tolstoy, and as I said, in every situation, at every time, and in every place. You could always find some way to make it applicable. And that was a beautiful thing. And I really do agree that we shouldn't condemn Tolstoy because he failed at times to adhere to the very things that he was espousing. We can't expect Tolstoy to be perfect in that. What we can expect, and the same thing that I talked about in my pastorally persona earlier, is that we always try to keep it in focus. We always try to be reflective, self-reflective, and look at our own deficiencies and see where we can make changes and see what we can aspire to. That simplicity was a beautiful thing in my mind. And we see with others like Gandhi and King, they had very specific applications for how they wanted to use nonviolence or how they wanted to use pacifism. And, especially in King's case, and I think it may be because of his Christian foundations, eventually he had to reflect on, well, if this is working in this regard for this specific thing, perhaps it is applicable elsewhere in life. Perhaps there is more emphasis to be placed on the Sermon on the Mount to all aspects of life.
Well, and this is something I wanted to get to as well, and I love that because if we quote some, like with on our Facebook page or something, we quote somebody from like Gandhi, and they're like, well, Gandhi was this and that, he did this and that. And I'm like, does that change what he said though? Whether he was I always get hit with this, well, he was a child molester. I don't know. I don't know anything about that. What I do know is what he said sounds a lot like Jesus. And so that doesn't change what he said, or, and even Martin Luther King Jr., they come out and said that he was cheating on his wife and all this stuff. Okay, I don't know. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. I don't know. But does it change what he said? And when Tolstoy did whatever, does it change what he said? And what I find so frustrating with Christians is before you start blasting somebody for their, like you said, deficiencies, maybe make sure that your stuff's in line first. And that's what I do. I try to do it myself. Before I start going at somebody, I was like, well, make sure that your stuff's in order before. And it's never going to be in order. That's the thing. We're not going to get all this figured out in this lifetime. That's what I think is so beautiful about the afterlife, the idea that we're going to be able to figure this out as we go along, even after we pass away from this life. Before I start judging somebody, I got to make sure that my stuff's in line first.
It's a very important thing. And of course, when you bring up things like that, it certainly muddies the water in many ways. And I think, it's justifiable to at least squint at what someone tells you to do if you discover that they themselves aren't necessarily always adhering to it. When I say squint, that just means look at it with a little bit more discernment. If what you're reading in and of itself and by itself is beneficial to you and to those around you and to your broader community, then it stands alone on its own as being a good thing. It's one of those situations. I often find that when someone brings that up, when you're having a discussion about a very specific thing that someone said or wrote about a very specific matter, and someone throws out of left field, yeah, well, Gandhi was a child molester. It's usually a deflection because they don't want to talk about the actual topic. That in no way, shape, or form condones, if Gandhi was a child molester. I'm certainly not condoning that. But it's typically because someone doesn't want to have that discussion about that very specific thing because they may or may not have a good argument against it. And so, it tends to be a deflection, especially in online conversation.
Yeah.
It's inescapable in online conversation. And again, it goes back to kind of our conversation before with Dr. Hart, where, he often laments the fact that no one will actually engage the argument he is making. And instead they just bring something else up that's supposed to condemn the whole thing that doesn't. And it's like, well, we're not arguing about the Fifth Ecumenical Council. We're arguing about this specific thing that I said, which, and it tends to be a situation where people are just trying to deflect from the actual discussion.
Straw man arguments are one of my favorites. I mean, I enjoy the straw man argument so much because it brings so much to the conversation. It's really making the conversation more fruitful. And if y'all don't know me by now, I'm being very satirical when I'm saying this because I really hate straw man arguments.
Yeah.
I really despise straw man arguments because if you want to engage somebody with the topic, about the specific topic, don't come at me with a straw man because I'm going to disengage very quickly because I don't have time for that garbage.
Yeah.
You talk about Bentley Hart. I mean, I kind of get it. I kind of get why he would be frustrated. He's got something to talk about and somebody wants to come at him. Well, what about this? We're not talking about that. We're talking about this. It's when it comes to that topic of universalism, it always goes down to like a straw man. And even with pacifism, it always turns into a straw man argument somehow, and I don't get it. Why can't we just have a conversation? Okay, yes, I'm a flawed human being. Nicholas is a flawed human being. You can pinpoint our flaws, but let's talk about Jesus. He was without flaw, and Jesus said this. If Jesus said this, Like Tolstoy is saying, Jesus said this when it came to the Sermon on the Mount. This is how it can be applied to every part of our life. Jesus said this. Tolstoy didn't say this. Tolstoy's making the case because Jesus said this.
Right, right. And that's another argument that Tolstoy used to make, is that when people are criticizing his beliefs, it's not that they have a problem with him or his beliefs. It's that they actually have a problem with Jesus.
Yes, exactly. That's what I say sometimes when it turns into these straw man arguments. Like, you're not arguing with me, you're arguing with Jesus right now. This is not something that Craig pulled out of the air and started saying himself. No, I'm quoting Jesus Christ himself.
Right, right.
He said this. He said, Peter, put away the sword.
Right.
And when it comes to Christians involved with the state, Jesus said, it would not be so among you. Jesus said this. Craig didn't say this.
This is me being totally honest right now. I enjoy more than anything in this world when I stumble into a Christian anarchist Facebook page and someone cites Peter, the whole sword by a sword.
Yes.
I love it when people cite that as Jesus condoning violence.
Yes.
Condoning weapons. Boy, and in fact, I probably need to repent of that, because it provides too much joy in my life for me to be able to sit down. And in fact, I think I have a Word document saved where I just explained it all for one post, and then I just go back and copy and paste it.
Well, I mean, because you keep repeating it. It's the same thing. They're missing it for some reason. When it comes to like the whole bias sword, keep reading. He says why to do it, but you can't stop there.
If you just read 2 verses further or something like that, it quite literally says, so that the prophecy might be fulfilled, which is a prophetic account from the Old Testament about 2 swords and being labeled the brigands by the Romans. It's so quite literally so that the Romans will have an excuse to arrest Jesus and crucify him, so that the prophecy might unfold. I mean, it's not.
It doesn't mean go to your local gun shop and buy a 9mm.
Yeah,
that's not what Jesus is condoning. It's not what Jesus is telling you to do. Keep reading.
It's not. Don't go buy your Jesus Glock. It's not a. It's not an admonition for weapon sales.
I love that. I love that conversations. I'm like you when I stumble into these conversations, and a lot of times I'll start the conversation not on purpose to get into this topic because I know where it's going. I just read something like I mentioned, like the Rival Nations article. I just read it. I was like, this is great. This is beautiful. And I read it and I shared it. It was a picture of a guy holding a pistol. And all of a sudden it turns, well, go buy a sword. Okay, keep reading. And then what happens when Peter tried to defend Jesus? Jesus said, put it away.
Right. Right.
And then what did Jesus do? He healed the guy that was arresting him.
Right. Right.
How is this missed? Why is this glossed over, Nicholas? I don't understand why that portion of that topic is glossed over.
Look, the Bible is a story in totality. You can't piece it out and then proclaim to understand the fullness of who and what Christ was by saying, this individual verse or this individual story means this specifically. It's a story that only unfolds in its own totality. And so, it's one of those situations where certainly you can find stories and verses that have very specific, very understandable meanings. But again, to bring back origin, we talk about so often we come across stumbling blocks where something we read in the Bible doesn't seem to be congruent with what we understand about Jesus Christ. And that usually means that we have to look at a deeper level of what the text is saying. If it makes sense on its face, then it's meant to be taken at face value. If it's more difficult to understand in relation to our understanding of Jesus, then we have to think about it a little bit more. And it probably contains a deeper spiritual message that maybe we aren't going to be able to draw from it just by taking the words for what they mean on the page. It's one of those things, and it's different for each person. which really can complicate the matter. It's just who we are as people again. We draw a conclusion first, and then we go to the Bible to look for things that might support it. And so we look for those specific passages that might support what we have to say. And if we continue reading a couple lines further, we see that maybe if I included those 2 lines, that passage might not actually be in line with what I'm trying to say. So let's cut those off, and we'll just use verses 1 through 14 instead of 1 through 16.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the whole Romans 13 argument right there. I mean, how many times are you hit with Romans 13 as a Christian anarchist?
Look, man, I had to preach on Romans 13 a few months back, and
you had to, or you couldn't wait to?
Well, it was initially a moment of apprehension on my part. I thought, oh boy, I've been toying around and walking on eggshells, trying not to come out as a completely crazy anarchist in front of this very orthodox congregation for some time now. I guess they're finally going to get to see who I really am. And, it was a blessing. And I found this to be a blessing. Very interesting, actually. If my rector preached the way I do on Romans 13, or I've had the opportunity to teach on pacifism several times, if he preached the way I did, they would have torches and pitchforks in his front yard by nightfall. But I have found that even some of the most ardently, I don't know how you would describe it exactly. They're certainly, they adhere to a very American understanding of the Bible, I guess is the way to put it. I don't know. It's not a very efficient way to say it, but they have given me grace for the simple fact that I'm a combat wounded veteran who's speaking to pacifism. And so because they assume by, that label that I know what violence really is like, that they're willing to give me the time to speak on why pacifism matters.
Well, I mean, I think that's a great point too, because you have, I don't know if the word clout is the right word to use here, but you have an experience that a lot of people have not experienced before. So they're going to listen to you coming from that perspective because you have an experience that they have not experienced. And when you're talking about pacifism as a war veteran, or if you're talking about the government as a war veteran, I understand that, because I'm always very thrilled to talk to veterans on this show, because and next week I'm talking to somebody who was he's a war vet. He's a very decorated military. I can't remember if it's the Marines or Army. I can't remember for sure, but he's got this perspective about war, and I always love these conversations because I didn't experience it, and I think it's important for Christians to be able to listen to folks like yourself who have experienced it, and then you're coming at it with a perspective now, well, I'm a pacifist, and I don't entangle myself with the state any longer.
There's something clarifying, when you see someone going between 2 extremes, between war, which is one extreme, and pacifism, which is another extreme. When you hear that about a person, most people are probably intrigued, I would imagine, because that's a pretty profound transformation.
Right.
So when they hear that, it probably becomes curious to them, like how and why would something like that occur? And so there's probably a curiosity aspect to it. There's probably an aspect of it where, they themselves, maybe they feel like they live a normal, somewhat mundane life, and maybe they're about to experience some aspect of something they've never experienced before that might be profound for them. And I'm certainly appreciative of it, because it allows me to speak more to my own personal beliefs, and to be more authentic in front of people. And they, very thankfully, they show me grace and listen to me. They hear me oftentimes, when I think that people who haven't necessarily had an experience like that, they might not be given that grace to be heard by others so easily.
Right. I mean, yeah, you can sit here and listen to Craig spout off about pacifism on the Bad Roman podcast, or Craig spout off about Romans 13 on the Bad Roman podcast. But when somebody who's experienced it firsthand starts spouting off about pacifism and Romans 13, I get it. I understand why somebody's more willing to listen to Nicholas talk about this than they would Craig, because Craig's just got an opinion and Craig's never experienced, but Nicholas has experienced it. So I understand. That's why I said I'm so thrilled to be able to talk to folks like you and next week, Joe Chadburn. And you remember that conversation you and I did with Eric Campbell on the show?
Yeah.
I was listening to you guys talk back and forth, and y'all were saying things that I did not understand, but it was fascinating to me. Like y'all were just talking to each other. I was like, I don't know what that means, but this is fascinating. And y'all were just having a ball. And I felt like this guy, like I'd like to treat the podcast like we're just having a conversation and people are eavesdropping in on our conversation. Well, I was eavesdropping in on yours and Eric's conversation during that show, and I loved it because y'all knew what y'all were saying. I'm like, and I was just this total ignorant idiot in the background, like, oh, I don't know what that means, but this sounds fascinating. I want to learn more. I want to hear more what they're talking about.
Well, Craig, I hate to tell you, it's not because you haven't experienced the things we have. About half your audience probably turns off the show as soon as they hear you're from Arkansas. So
I'm not from Arkansas, though.
Hold on. You're from Texas, right?
Look, I wore this T-shirt just for you. See my Texas flag right here on my T-shirt? I was like, what am I going to wear today? Oh, I'm going to see if Nicholas is going to pick on me wearing a T-shirt that's got a Texas flag on it. And you haven't said anything, and then you accuse me of being from Arkansas. Listen, I lived in Arkansas for 25 years, but I'm not from Arkansas.
Okay. Somebody
told me I'm a Tennessean. No, I'm not.
I got confused there for a moment, and I apologize. So here's the thing. How is an upstanding, only mildly annoying Texan like yourself an Arkansas fan?
Well, I mean, I lived in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where the university is, and it's kind of infectious when you live in there. Growing up in Texas, I hated the Longhorns. To be honest, at the time, I liked the Baylor Bears some. I liked the Texas A&M Aggies some. But I hated the Longhorns. And when I moved to Arkansas, everybody get that horns down when they find out we're from Texas. Like, yeah, I'm with you. You're right. I don't like them either.
It's sort of like when I lived in Alabama and I became an Auburn fan out of spite.
You also have to understand this, too, about Fayetteville, Arkansas, too. There's a lot of Texans that go to school at the University of Arkansas. There's a lot of Texans there.
Yeah, I don't know why for a moment there I thought that you were from Arkansas, because now the memories are flooding back to me of all the times that, I made sure to inform you that Texas has wonderful smoked meats, but they're not barbecue because it's not whole hog.
Oh, I would never call it barbecue. You don't call it barbecue in Texas. When people call it barbecue, I'm like, that's not barbecue.
Okay, it's like a northerner saying, we're going to have a barbecue. And it's like, well, what's your idea of a barbecue? And it's like, we're going to throw some hot dogs and hamburgers on.
Yeah. It's like a northerner putting beans and chili. We don't do that in Texas either.
Like, brother, we are speaking two different languages right now.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with your picnic.
Well, you put some barbecue sauce on your hot dog on the grill, that's a barbecue. Okay, but that's not what we do in Texas.
No.
All right, before I let you go, I want to say something about David Bentley Hart. I'm giving a shout out to Abby Kleckner for recommending this or pointing out this translation of the New Testament that he did. And apparently he's got a new one out, another translation that I did. I think it was Keith Giles posted about it. I was not aware that he had another one, but this translation of this New Testament I love it. I love reading it because you can read it. And you read it when you're reading how it's translated, like directly from the Greek, and I love it because it changes the way you read the Bible. It has changed the way I've read the Bible, and I've brought this up on the show before. When you go to Acts 5, and when it says, like I mentioned our T-shirt, we ought to obey God rather than man. I went to Acts 5 and read it, and the way it's translated is it is necessary that we obey God rather than man. And that one word necessary, and I apologize to everybody listening to this because y'all have heard me talk about this more than once on the show, but that one word necessary made that scripture more powerful to me. It made it more important. It is necessary. And it's not we ought to. No, it's necessary that we obey God rather than man. And I think if Christians took that more seriously, they would step away from the state. They would step away from their entanglement with government because it's necessary that we obey God rather than man. And you said this earlier about with Martin Luther King. If there's a law that follows the law of God, then it's a justifiable law. The problem when it comes to laws and the government is somebody, and I mentioned this to you before we started recording, somewhere along the way when it comes to government laws, somebody somewhere is being harmed in some fashion because that law could turn into a different law, or they could use this law to justify putting somebody in a cage for smoking a plant. I mean, come on. I'm real hesitant to follow that line of thinking like MLK was saying, because I know at the end of the day, there's going to be another law that they can play off of with that one law that's going to put somebody in a cage, or it's going to harm somebody somewhere in some fashion. I mean, I asked Keith Giles and Jason Porterfield on the show when we talked about the early church, very early on in the project. I said, point to me somewhere that the government, whatever the government's doing, show me somewhere that what they're doing is not harming somebody somewhere in some fashion. I'll eat your hat. You know what I mean? So I just went on a different, like, all over the place, because I started with David Bentley Hart and the translation, and then I went into the MLK and the laws and this stuff. But anyway,
I mean, it's so with David Bentley Hart's, I have not read his translation yet, but Father Hart, the rector of our church, will often, as Anglicans, we use the KJV exclusively. But he does point out quite a few differences in translation using his brother's text. And I think the biggest emphasis for his brother's text, if I understand it correctly, is ensuring that the Greek words that were used in writing the Bible are being translated in a way that is truthful to the context of the time. So how the word would have been used and would have meant at the time it was written, which can sometimes throw some significant changes into the way a text is interpreted. It's very interesting, and the fact that he does use the word necessary is a very interesting difference. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think as Christians, Christ didn't walk around simply disobeying the Romans just because they were the Romans and they were the state, and he was, required to disobey the state. Christ walked around with an understanding of obeying God's law, of obeying the law. And in any instance where God's law and Roman law were congruent and were complementary of one to the other, then, Christ isn't disobeying that simply because it is a societal law. And so, Christian anarchists in the proper sense are not people who just go around breaking laws for the simple fact that they're anarchists.
Right.
We just don't associate with government when it is unnecessary for us to. It's in the most literal sense, it's just seeking to live a life as independent of government as possible.
Well, and it reminds me of something that Tertullian said, and I bring him up all the time. He said, we're not interested in your meetings.
Right.
The affairs of the state are completely foreign to us.
Right.
And then it should be completely foreign to us. When you get into how you mentioned Jesus, I mean, he didn't walk around breaking laws because he was an anarchist. He just walked around living. Right. When you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He walked around doing that. And if he came into conflict with what the state was saying, he didn't. Well, I'm gonna do what the state says. No, and it's like Tertullian said, it's completely foreign to us. We have no interest in your meetings. I will not occupy a voter's booth.
Well, if we were to take David Bentley Hart's interpretation of, it is necessary to follow God over men, to listen to God instead of listening to men, it very much is in line with Tolstoy's own understanding that, the title of his book, The Kingdom of God is Within You.
Yes.
We are to live in such a way as to make tangible the kingdom of God. And so it's not so much, oftentimes, especially in America, we have Christians who are awaiting the second coming of Christ and the kingdom of God. I think Tolstoy would argue that we live in a time where we are capable of assisting in that that kingdom of God on earth, and that it's somewhat of an Augustine concept. It's where the will of the individual has to meet the grace of God. That it's certainly not Calvinist in its understanding. It's very much that you have a role to play in making this happen.
Right.
That requires you to live in a way that Christ commanded you to live. And I say this so many times in church, at the pulpit. We're called to love our neighbor as ourselves. The real problem in today's society that I see is that how can we love our neighbor if we don't first love ourselves? And so it's very Tolstoyan in the sense that first make right your own life.
Yes.
And then make right your interactions with others.
Right.
And when you do that, you are bringing about the kingdom of God.
When you figured your own stuff out, then you can go tell other people how to live. That's pretty much, you talked about simplicity earlier. I say this all the time. When I get back to the very basics, just keep it simple, stupid. I tell myself that all the time. Keep it simple, stupid, Craig. Just keep it simple, and then everything else is going to work itself out. Man, Nicholas, I enjoy talking to you so much, and I've missed getting to have conversations with you like we used to online, and I do miss you picking on me from time to time. So please feel free to send me a text to pick on me, or just pop in on one of my posts just to pick on me, because I do miss it.
Well, look, man, I can't say that life is going to get simpler in the very near future. We have a third child that's due on May 3rd.
Oh, it's the day after my birthday.
But is it really?
Yeah, May 2nd is my birthday.
Well, it could happen happen early. The little anarchist is back. Ow, do not pull my beard, young lady. But yeah, so I should be getting some paternity leave. So who knows? I may be back on the Facebook pages before long.
Well, hey, man, we're going to be in Nashville for a Bad Roman meetup. I don't know if y'all can make your way down there to hang out and eat some beautiful smoked meats. We had Jay Newman on the show, and he's a pit master. We're going to meet at Shotgun Willie's to eat some of his beautiful smoked meats. And
when is this?
Hang out on the end of June, the last weekend of June. We're going to go to Nashville. Some people, we're just going to meet up. Chris Polk, Darren, a lot of folks are going to show up to just hang out as Christian anarchists and eat some beautiful smoked meats. We may even make it down to Music Row at some point and do a little dancing. I don't know if you got your two-stepping boots in line, but we might do some of that as well.
Trust me, you do not want me to two-step anything.
But I'd like to see it happen. That way I can pick on you about something. Yeah, I think it'll be great. It'd be cool. It's going to be fun just to be able to meet folks face to face instead of doing this, online and stuff, because as much as I enjoy this, the physical or face-to-face interactions are so much more important, and I think it really gives us strength to keep going, to remind ourselves that we're not really that crazy. We're just trying to figure this stuff out as we go.
Don't get me wrong, Craig. You might be crazy about other things.
I'm pretty crazy about a lot of things.
And thinking that brisket is real barbecue, but no, I agree. I think so one of the things that I'm most ardent about at my church is we're called to be a community. And I think, whether you consider yourself an anarchist or what have you, Christian anarchist, there is a beautiful thing that comes out of a real sense of community that we all crave on a spiritual level, a physical level, a mental level. And I agree with you. I think it's a wonderful thing when people of like mind, or not even necessarily of like mind, who come together and can discuss things and fellowship. I will certainly talk to my wife. I always enjoy a good trip that's barbecue centered.
Oh yeah, it's gonna be centered around some smoked meats and some music. I mean, I've never been to Nashville. We tried to do this, right before the COVID thing hit, and then it shut everything down. And I was like, if I can't go to Nashville without listening to music, I don't want to go. So we just postponed it. Now, 3 years later, we're going to try it again. Who knows if the government's going to try and lock the state, the world down again?
Yeah.
To keep the Christian anarchists, the bad Romans, from showing up in Nashville. We'll see. But as of right now, it's on like Donkey Kong, and we're going to go to Nashville and hang out.
Sounds good. I'll talk to my wife. That certainly sounds like a trip I'd like to make.
Awesome, man. All right, buddy. I really do. Like I said, I really do miss talking to you, and I cherish every time I do get to speak to you, because you bring some common sense to the conversation that is missed a lot of times, and I really do appreciate the work that you're doing, and I really appreciate how you seem so centered right now. And I appreciate that about you. And I want you to know that I think about you often, and I hope that we can connect some more, in the future.
I appreciate that, Craig. And I really do. I miss, sometimes when you're doing this type of work where you're just buried in writing and reading all the time, it can become, more of a labor than a love and a passion. And so when I get to, do stuff like this and actually like go out and just be a part of a community, the way things used to be, as I, a bit of a nostalgia, it's always really helpful to kind of put it into perspective that like it really is something meaningful. And it gives me a little bit of a boost, and a little bit of added morale to keep on trying to do the work and eventually be able to hopefully make a difference for some folks. That's the goal, is just hoping that people will read it and just give it some thought. I don't even care if it's completely persuasive for you. Just as long as you'll seriously think about it and maybe question a few things in your own life. And if you don't feel persuaded by it, that's fine. I just want people to maybe open their eyes a little bit more and maybe be open to being self-reflective.
All right, before I let you go, so this piece that you sent me, they can't find it online, but eventually it's going to be out there where people, because you're going to add to it and possibly turn it into a book. So
yeah, so the goal is I'm presenting at a conference for the Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence in April, and I'll be presenting on this paper, which is a paper, broadly comparing Tolstoy and King. And the paper itself is serving as kind of a dissertation in miniature for my Ph.D. project, which will eventually culminate in me writing a dissertation that hopefully can be published as a book. So you may be able to see, the hope is that the paper that I currently just sent to Craig will be published in the Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence as it is. But regardless of whether or not that happens, hopefully within the next few years, it'll be in book form. So
if people are interested to read what you sent me, maybe they can reach out to you, and you can send it their way, and they can read what you sent me.
Yeah, no, that would be perfectly fine. And I don't know if the conference, I'll have to check and see. It might be possible for people to participate in the conference as well, where I'll be presenting the paper. So if that's of interest, you can certainly reach out to me, and I'd be happy to get you the information.
All right, cool. So they can find you. Just look up Nicholas Harrelson on Facebook, or
look up Nicholas Harrelson on Facebook, or you can email me. My email is nicholas.harrelson@duke.edu, and I can send that to Craig if you wanted to put it in the commentary or whatever.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Okay, yeah.
All right, buddy, man. I really appreciate it. And we'll definitely do this again, because when that book's published, I mean, I don't care if it's 17 years from now, we're going to get you back on the show. We'll still be talking about No King But Christ.
It very well could be 17 years from now. I keep having kids. So.
Yeah. Stop having kids. Get them all graduated, and then write a book.
Yeah. All
right, buddy. I will talk to you soon.
Yep, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Bad Roman Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts to never miss an episode. And while you're at it, if you like what you heard, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, it really helps people find us. 100% of donations are given to local charities in Memphis, Tennessee. To learn more about the Bad Roman Project and to find show notes, please visit thebadroman.com.